Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to introduce our next speaker, Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield, former State Department Special Envoy and former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Ambassador Bloomfield has researched the Iran issues from policy, human rights, and the evil nature of the regime in Tehran. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Bloomfield.
It's my honor to join my friends, my fellow citizens from the Virginia chapter of the Organization of Iranian American Communities in this somber event. Everyone who is here today knows exactly why this display is sitting on the Capitol Mall. They know all about what I'm going to tell you. But some people who are watching remotely by video may ask themselves, why are we talking about an event, a terrible event that happened 32 years ago? There are many bad things that happened in the world. This was a long time ago. Why are we here today? The answer is that the massacre of political prisoners in 1988 was one of the worst crimes against humanity in the world in the post-World War II era. We did not know this at the time internationally. It was not known. The Iran regime lied to the UN rapporteur. They suppressed the truth, and they sent a different image about what had happened. But the truth has come out, and we now know what really happened. In fact, we also know that the people who sent these political prisoners to their death for their personal beliefs, for their religious and political beliefs, are still in power today in very high positions. So we have the proof, we have those who are culpable, and now we must act. But I will go further than that. I'm here to say that the 1988 massacre of political prisoners in Iran is the key to understanding what happened to the religious legitimacy of Ayatollah Khomeini's caliphate, his experiment with 12-er Shi'ism. This was the pivot point where the sense of legitimacy of a divine embodiment, a supreme leader with all power, was taken away from the top cleric in Iran and handed to someone else who has been the supreme leader ever since. This was a pivotal moment in Iran's history. It is also an event that opens the window and lets us see who were these people who were killed. Their pictures are sitting in front of me today. It's a very somber view. But who were they? In America, for years, we've heard things about the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, the PMOI, and we've been told, well, they were terrorists, they were a cult, they were Marxists, etc. But when you study what happened in 1988, the regime tells you who they really were. The regime asked them only one question: do you still believe in this modern version of Islam that means freedom, that means gender equality, that means science, that means progress, that means political rights? Do you still believe in that? And proudly they all answered yes, and immediately they were sent to their deaths. Now, there was a UN rapporteur, an El Salvador scholar, who was sent to Iran in the earlier 1980s. You see, after the revolution, there were two schools of thought. Khomeini arrived with his vision of a medieval, strict version of Islam. But there were others who were followers of nationalism, of Mossadegh, the prime minister, the first elected president, the head of the MEK. They were all very active, holding rallies, calling for political rights. This became unacceptable to Khomeini. Prime Minister Bazargan resigned immediately after the American embassy was seized by Khomeini's followers. He resigned in protest. President Bani Sadr, who participated in public rallies for political rights, was impeached, and his close colleagues were murdered by the regime. Mr. Rajavi called on the nation to take to the streets, and on June 20th, Khomeini, in 1981, started a reign of terror. And this began a gruesome period in Iran's history where children, boys, girls, men, and women were arrested simply for printing political materials and talking about their vision of a modern Iran. They went to jail, they were tortured, many were executed. This is why the UN sent a rapporteur. So in 1988, when the Iran-Iraq war finally reached a ceasefire, Ayatollah Khomeini had cancer. He was in his last year. He was very angry at having to accept a ceasefire. And then when the MEK who were in Iraq tried to come into Tehran and overthrow the government, they were stopped short of the nation's capital. But Khomeini ordered the annihilation of all who believe, of all of what he called the hypocrites, the people who didn't accept his version of Islam that was so strict and so brutal. And so not one of these political prisoners faced a death sentence, not one. Many had completed their punishment for their political views and had gone home. They were seized from their homes. They were taken from the jails before 3 judge panels in Tehran and other cities in Iran. And they were asked really about their views. Do you still accept, are you still loyal to this point of view? The hypocrites, the munafiqeen, the MEK, do you still accept that? And these were proud people. They said, yes, I do. And all of them were taken off by the thousands from late July 1988 to early November. They were marched off. They were hung inside halls from the rafters. 6 at a time, they were hung from cranes. Regime operatives pulled on their legs to speed up their death. They were lined up in front of swimming pools and machine gunned into the pool so they could drain the blood. The regime took their bodies. They were wrapped up and they were put together in mass graves that were unmarked. Their possessions were taken to the door of their anxious families, and their relatives were told, I'm sorry, your son, your daughter, your spouse is dead. Here are the possessions. And they were never told where they were buried, an act of unspeakable cruelty. And so these 3 judge panels sent tens of thousands of political prisoners to their deaths. The rapporteur from the UN didn't know enough. He asked questions. He was told, no, there's nothing here, nothing to worry about. But one person knew what happened. He was actually in charge of the prisons. That was the Grand Marja of Iran, Ayatollah Hossein Ali Montazeri. He was the leading scholar of Islam in Iran. And Khomeini, of course, had him lined up to become the successor as supreme leader. But after Montazeri asked questions of the imam, why are you doing this? These people are not guilty of a death sentence. We can't do this. This is a crime. Khomeini became impatient and he pushed Montazeri aside. And instead, he reached to a reliable clerical bureaucrat, Ali Khamenei, who was the president of Iran at that point, a functionary who was not an Ayatollah. He was not a grand Ayatollah. His religious credentials were not strong. But Khomeini knew that he would keep the regime together and use as much force as he needed to. So what happened after the new supreme leader took over? In 1989, recall, Salman Rushdie suffered a fatwa. Khomeini wanted him put to death for writing satanic verses. Well, under Khamenei, 4 of the translators of that book were attacked in their home capitals. The Japanese translator was killed in Tokyo. Others were attacked in Oslo, in Turkey, and in Italy. After that, in 1990, Kazem Rajavi, the eminent human rights advocate in Geneva, who had been the regime's, the Islamic Republic's first ambassador to UN agencies before becoming the representative of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Rajavi was assassinated by a regime hit team on the streets of Geneva, Switzerland. In 1991, the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires was blown up by Iranian operatives. F-4 jets from Iran were sent over Iraq, breaking the ceasefire, and were shot on Camp Ashraf, trying to kill Masoud Rajavi, which they did not do. And so the reign of terror continued inside and outside the country. A group of assassins were sent to Berlin in 1992 and went into the Mykonos restaurant and machine gunned Kurdish leaders from Iran who were resistance leaders. And in 1994, the Jewish Community Center in Argentina was bombed, the worst terrorist attack in Argentina's history. And Alberto Nisman, the investigator, was murdered in 2015, the night before he was going to reveal his findings about this bombing. This is all under Khamenei. And of course, in 2016, 19 American airmen were killed when Khobar Towers was bombed by Iran inside Saudi Arabia. So a reign of terror started inside the country. Khamenei extended it outside the country. Executions inside the country, terrorism, hit teams, and intelligence propaganda trying to cover it all up. This is what we have seen for years. And even today in 2020, for 30 years, Iran has been the #1 state sponsor of terrorism to this day. So where do we stand? What have we learned? In the year 2000, Ayatollah Montazeri's diaries were released, and we saw the communications with the imam. Imam, you can't do this. These people are not guilty of the death penalty. In December of 2016, audio tapes emerged where we heard his voice lecturing the clerical leaders, saying, "We will not be in power forever. We will be remembered by history for this horrendous crime." And that is one reason we are all here today, to make sure that they are not in power forever and they are remembered for this horrendous crime. We now have the evidence. We have witnesses. As you recall, the MEK was in Iraq, and after 2009, with the help of Iraqi Prime Minister Maliki, Iranian militia and Iranian agents chased them and imprisoned them and attacked them 7 times, with 140 killed, 7 abducted and never heard from again, and well over 1,000 wounded. These were defenseless men and women. Finally, in 2016, with the help of the UN, they made it to Albania, a safe place, where they have built Ashraf 3 outside of Tirana. Here, you will meet the witnesses who know what happened in the prisons. They have recreated the torture chambers. You can see exactly what was done. You can hear the story of 1988 firsthand. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves today facing an important imperative around the world, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in the United Nations. We cannot ignore 1988 anymore. Now we know this was one of the largest crimes against humanity in history. Now we know we have proof, witnesses, evidence. And now we know that the people who sat on the 3 judge panels are in Tehran today in high positions of power. You know, the United States and some of its allies don't always agree on the approach to policy with Iran. That's true, I admit that. But they've never disagreed on issues of human rights and the core issues. No one complained when justice was done with Hitler's lieutenants for the Holocaust, or the killing fields of Cambodia, or the crimes that were committed in the Yugoslavia wars of the 1990. They all faced justice. And this is what must happen with the people who sent these 30,000 political prisoners to their death for their beliefs, not for their crimes. We have a chance now to move forward. Some of the background of this has not been known before today, but there's an American musician, a popular musician called Norman Hutchins, who has a famous saying, "If you didn't know, now you know." And so I call upon my government and other governments and the United Nations to start moving now, collect the evidence, build the dossiers, stand for principle, and bring to justice and accountability the guilty in Iran for this heinous crime. And while you're at it, they must stop continuing these extrajudicial killings. They have now arrested, and one of the great athletes of Iran, a wrestler, Navid Afkari, faces a death sentence. His brothers are facing decades of prison sentences. Why? Because they stood outside in a protest and said, "I don't like what's going on." How could any of us endure the injustice in Iran? We would all wish to be brave enough to protest, even at the penalty of imprisonment, torture, and death. These are brave people, ladies and gentlemen. Let us stand with them. Thank you.